My name is Delli Carpini. As you can see, I'm the Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication here at the University of Pennsylvania. And it's a great pleasure to be the moderator of today's panel entitled, What is Reality? From News to Reality TV. Those of you in the audience around my age might recognize the phrase, what is reality, as a mantra from the late 1960s and early 1970s. And since then, has occasionally been used in movies and retrospectives to caricature the counterculture movement of those years. But underlying this phrase are quite serious questions. Questions regarding the nature of truth, the difference between fact and fiction, the nature of authenticity and celebrity, and ultimately the ways in which we come to know about the world we live in and find our own place in that world. These questions have taken on more pressing importance in recent years as economic, political, and cultural and environmental changes have taken place, complicating the media in which we live, and challenging some of our traditional commonsensical notions, such as the distinction between public and private, between spontaneous and scripted, or between even news and entertainment. Perhaps nowhere is this clearer than with the growing phenomenon of reality television, which is coming to dominate the airwaves in a variety of different formats, some of which are old, some of which are new, all of which I think change the way we think about our relationship to other people. And while we use the term reality television as a motif for this panel, it's really more about the changes in the media environment that have taken place more broadly and how that's affected various aspects of social and political and cultural life. Today we have two distinguished alumni from Penn who will grapple with some of these issues and their implications. The first is Lloyd Z. Remick. Mr. Remick is an attorney who concentrates his practice in the areas of entertainment, sports, hospitality, and communications law. He's also president of Zane Management Incorporated, a Philadelphia-based sports, entertainment, and communications consulting and management firm. His clients have included several award-winning recording artists, as well as writers and producers, and a number of television, radio, entertainment, and sports personalities who may give us a little glimpse into that world during our session today. Mr. Remick received his BS from Wharton School in 1959 and his JD from Temple University School of Law in 1962 and his LLM in tax law from Villanova School of Law in 1984. He also teaches entertainment and sport law at Temple University School of Law and the legal aspects of hospitality and tourism at the Temple University School of Hospitality and Tourism. Mr. Remick was voted one of the, quote, best, brightest, wiliest, winningest, and most tenacious and efficacious attorneys, as well as the best entertainment and sports attorney in Philadelphia by Philadelphia Magazine at several different points. He's also been elected to the 2007 through 2009 editions of Best Lawyers in America, and interestingly is listed in the Who's Who in American Law and Who's Who in American Poetry. Our second speaker is Peter Canellos. Peter has been the Boston Globe's Washington bureau chief and author of the weekly National Perspective column since 2003. He oversees all the Globe's national coverage. From 1999 to 2003, Canellos served as Metro editor, overseeing all local coverage. He covered the presidential campaigns in 1992 and 1996, I believe also more recently in 2008, serving as national roving correspondent for a time, the Sunday writer emphasizing legal affairs. He was City Hall bureau chief in 1992 and 1993 and was the lead reporter on the 1993 mayoral race. He began his career at the paper in 1988, first covering housing and urban affairs, as well as general assignments and overnight police beat. Peter is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and Columbia Law School. I think Penn in '84, is that?
84, yeah.
Our format's a very simple one, especially since we have a relatively small group here. Each of our panelists will make a few brief comments on this general issue of celebrity, reality, news, and entertainment in the current information environment, talking from their own personal perspectives, just giving us a few insights. And then I'll open it up with a few specific questions to the panelists. And then we'll open it up for a more general discussion with me throwing my 2 cents in as it seems appropriate. And so why don't we start, maybe if you don't mind, Lloyd, just start maybe by talking a little bit about the work that you do and whether or not the current media environment that you live in, how that changes the way in which entertainment and sports and other personalities think about themselves and market themselves in this environment.
Good afternoon. First, let me say I'm very proud to be here because one of the items that we think about when we finally graduate from Penn is finally achieving, a half a century later, becoming an old guard. And Sunday I'm going to be playing tennis with 3 other old guards, hopefully, so there is some hope for some of this. Perception is reality, content is king. We've really just summed up everything. I think some of the most interesting things is the very perception and reality of what entertainment and sports lawyers do. Not too many of the younger crowd who really all want to be sports and entertainment lawyers and think in terms of Arliss on HBO or Jerry Maguire, Show Me the Money, Show Me the Money, in that famous film. Really think about entertainment or sports lawyers walking around in 3-piece suits with a white shirt, tie, and relatively short hair. There has been an incredible change in the last 40 years or so that I have been practicing in this field. And no more evident is it than in the world of music, the recording industry. There was a time when you were able to find a rock and roll group, and yes, after Penn I did have hair down to my shoulders for a few years. That was after the Department of Defense when it was a crew cut. We would find a rock and roll group or an R&B group, cut 2 demos with real live musicians. And then you would pick out one of 100 record companies, walk the 2 demos into a record company, and ask for $400,000, $500,000, certain amount of money just to produce the CD. In those days it was called an album. And the record companies understood that you built an artist. And they would give you tour support, and there was this new thing coming out called video, and they would subscribe a certain amount of money to video. And then you would work with the group, produce the album, put it out, try to get radio play. How the world has changed now. About 2000, there was this little blip on the sale of records. Records were selling about $14 billion in the United States, $40 billion in the world. And for the first time in 2000, it seems some government guys were talking to each other on these huge contraptions. Record industry didn't pay any attention to it. It was just for government talk back and forth on this thing called computers and the internet. And suddenly, 2000, record sales started to go down 5%. In 2001, they went down 9%. And each succeeding year, they went down more and more because everybody learned how to download from the internet and stop buying records or CDs. Interestingly enough, some of the best sales, and they're very little percentage-wise, is in my relative age group and 40s to 50s to 60s. How sad. Because the younger people all have downloading into iPods. They can walk around with 10,000 songs and not pay for them, which happens to be a violation of copyright laws, but we're not going to touch that today. So now what happens? A group goes in to their own little studio. They have their own equipment. They record something, and by that night, the world is watching it on MySpace and YouTube. and everybody thinks how wonderful they're going to become stars. The reality is, without the backing of a record company, that's not going to happen. And how does it happen in television? These days, television companies have learned it's much cheaper to put on reality television than to pay people to do sitcoms or shows. So there are no more your show shows. There are a few left remaining superstars, and they're being weeded out. And the networks and the cable companies have learned that if they can, and this is in quotes, slop together some, and the quote, ideas, they can throw it up, and it looks as if it's almost real. And I'm not sure that reality shows have any perception. I've handled a number of reality television shows. Some you think are terrific ideas. We have an opera singer who's world famous, and he happens to be a character as well. He's sung with Pavarotti, and he's gone to La Scala, and then he goes back to Pittsburgh, and he owns a little bar where he out curses, out smokes, and out fights anybody in the neighborhood. We decided what a reality show that would be. I mean, that's the Osmonds waiting to happen all over again. 2 years, and we're still trying to place it. At the same time, I had a soccer psychic mom. And I can't say it sounded like one of the silliest ideas that I ever pitched. That thing was on for 26 episodes. So you don't know what is reality, you don't know what perception is. And in the sports world, it has changed so much. So much is reality that when you are watching on television and you are seeing certain things that you could swear are really in the stadium, it's all a figment of your imagination. It's not real. It's contrived television put together. One of the very famous, I think I can say this, one of the very famous sports play-by-play people, the Hall of Fame voice of the Eagles, Merrill Reese, so well known, and he's done the Eagles for over, see, I'm from Philly, Eagles, 30-something years. When he first started out, he was telling me one time, he was in this little station. They had a certain amount of advertising. He was doing baseball games in this almost high school baseball league, and it was rained out. And his program director came in and said, Merle, go on the air and do that baseball game. And he literally said, batter up, first guy up, long swing, there it is, dribble ball to shortstop, and he went on and did a whole thing so the advertising could come into it. So what is reality? What is perception? I think it's just a figment of your mind anyway.
That's great, that's great. Peter, you're in the part of the business that used to be what we call reality television. Well, we never use that term, the news industry. How are some of the changes that have taken place economically and technologically affecting your business right now?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. And listening to Lloyd's presentation, I can certainly say that there are a lot of parallels between what's happening in the news business today and what happened probably 3 or 4 years previously in the music industry, and where the music industry is now eking out a little more money through micropayments and things like that for downloads on the web. Many people in the news industry are looking to Kindle, the Amazon Kindle, which is it sort of replicates a full screen kind of newspaper, as a possible way of monetizing the work that we do. But I think that when you're talking about the news business, some of the changes are even more profound because they go to the questions of how society is being served, particularly in politics and in terms of obtaining the information that you need, and it goes sort of beyond the economics of the news industry. One place where sort of the reality TV mentality and some of what Lloyd had been talking about YouTube and getting things up on the screen really quickly, One immediate example of how that's changed the news business was the George Allen campaign from 2006. I don't know how many of you remember this. He was a senator from Virginia, excuse me, a conservative Republican who had sort of modeled his career on George W. Bush. He was kind of roguishly charming and sort of a good old boy. He was also the son of the famous Washington Redskins football coach George Allen. And, was a popular but not especially respected senator who was expected to have, a fairly easy re-election in a conservative state, Virginia. He went down to campaign in a small town called Breaks, Virginia, way down on the southwestern part of the state. And under normal, that is pre-existing conditions, he was talking to a very, very conservative audience of all-white, rural folk. And he was being tracked at that time, as candidates now are, by critics, opponents, sometimes they're independent groups, sometimes they're actually working for the campaigns of their opponents, who videotape everything that the candidates say for possible attacks later on. Well, in this case, Allen thought he was being kind of charming by pointing out the guy who'd been tracking his campaign for a while, who happened to be an Indian American, and there's a scene of him sort of smiling, talking before this all-white audience, where he starts kind of making fun of the guy, saying, there's this guy out here has been tracking us, and I want you all to, give a big breaks round of applause for this guy out there. And he starts calling him Macaca, which I guess was the name that his inner circle had given to this guy. Well, the macaca turned out to be a type of monkey, a North African monkey, and a racial slur aimed at Indian people. And although Allen denied having any knowledge of any possible slur involved, his mother did come from North Africa. And this image of the senator kind of, joking, berating, and then using a racial insult to a 23, 24-year-old kid who was tracking him became a sensation on YouTube, and gradually sort of set about unraveling Allen's campaign, and he lost. And that was really the defining moment of that campaign. And it was something that occurred with no mainstream media involvement, with no mainstream media help. It was out there. It was a factor in people's minds before the Washington Post really even was aware of it. And they were the major paper covering that race. So that illustrates how much news has changed, and how much the internet and YouTube have altered what we do. Now, I will say that the pace of change is so extraordinary that even since 2006, things have changed considerably. And what was once a fairly innocent medium, I think, blogs and posting of videos that had viral and truly spontaneous reactions like that piece of tape of George Allen had, has now almost immediately been co-opted by political campaigns and groups with agendas. So now you can have the spectacle of what we had just these last months, where you have these quote-unquote Tea Party protests going on around the country that have been organized by conservative groups. And so you go to conservative websites, and if people are Republicans and conservatives, they love these websites, and they'll go to these websites, and a lot of people are getting their news from those sites. And you'll see pictures of people it makes it look like the country's up in arms over Barack Obama's policies, that there are people saying, this spending is out of control, it's too much. Now, there's something so dubious about it because people's taxes have not yet gone up. But nonetheless, on conservative websites, you can see right there the true viral video taken with someone's flip camera of people being up in arms. Likewise, you can go to some of the liberal sites like Think Progress and things like that and find flip camera videos intended to discredit those same protests, where they'll interview these people and it'll be quickly revealed that like a bus full of people came whose real issue was abortion and had nothing to do with Obama's spending, and they had clearly been brought in by conservative groups, and so it sort of undermines the whole idea that this is a grassroots protest. But what we have, obviously, is not just what people were noting about the web 5 years ago, which is that people are getting ideologically based information by going to websites that they already agree with and that tell them things that they want to hear. But you're actually having the events themselves sort of shaped and contrived and the video arranged to try to present it. So this all sort of adds up to an argument for the role that the mainstream media has played in the past when it was on a much firmer economic footing, the kind of unbiased reporting model that people talk about. And I will say that I'm enough of a critic of what we do that I think there have been some major failings in the mainstream media, and that more than the economic changes, or at least as much as the economic changes, we have alienated a generation of people. One was the coverage of the Iraq War, leading up to the Iraq War, that many people felt was way too deferential to the administration's position, and that in creating sort of a false he said, she said kind of thing never really came out and discredited some of the arguments that President Bush was making. And among young people in their 20s, I hear it all the time, they really turned off to the mainstream media. They just don't believe the news media is what it says it is. I think more recently, the business press failed to blow the whistle on some of the excesses in the economy. It may have been a tougher case, but a lot of people sort of rolling their eyes about how come they were reading in the newspaper business sections and in the business magazines all these profiles of high-flying Wall Street guys who then turned out to be crooks, and nobody seemed to blow the whistle on them. So I think the mainstream media can do a much better job, needs to do a much better job, is suffering from diminishing resources, but if anything, over time, the importance of the role that it has played is becoming more and more evident. And there may be in the next couple of years, a sense that we're going to have to do without it or do without it for a while. But I think the need for it is as strong as ever.
That's great, thank you. I want to start off with one question, actually to both of you from your different perspectives, that has to do with some of the issues that we just heard. And several years ago now, Don Imus got himself into trouble on his radio talk show and his television broadcast of that talk show on MSNBC for some racially tinged comments he made about the Rutgers women's basketball team. And that mixture of politics and entertainment, especially for a shock jock whose job, if you want to think of it that way, is to shock people with his comments. I'd love to hear from the point of view of somebody who works with the entertainment world what your take on that was, and where you would draw the line and how you think that was handled. But then also as a news story that emerged out of this entertainment world, I'd also be curious, Peter, to hear what you have to say about that as how news stories can suddenly emerge from places that you would never expect them to. So maybe, Lloyd, if you have some thoughts on that.
8 words: the practice of law is fraught with peril. The Don Imus situation, many of these situations, it's what you always fear when you are an entertainment lawyer and representing somebody. You can see a career go up in smoke in just a few seconds of a dumb comment. And what the normal, everyday person doesn't understand is that celebrities live in a fishbowl. Every move, they are stalked by paparazzi. People are all over them all the time. Politicians are now so afraid of what they are going to say that they try to stay only on a script. And sometimes when they're walking in and out, when a reporter will throw a question at them and they have a flip answer, they just want, their teams cringe. I've been involved in a fair amount of behind-the-scenes politics, and everyone is always afraid of what is going to come out. And now, the reality is, you can be sitting in a room like this, just having a talk amongst a few friends from the University of Pennsylvania, and there's a camera running. And probably tonight or tomorrow, some part of what Pete or the dean or I say will be on YouTube. And if you are clever in the way that you block it, it can really do damage. So from our point of view, it becomes very, very careful that you have got to select your words. And I am finding it in an entirely different place, Dean, that you would be well aware of, in the classroom. I've been an adjunct professor at Temple Law School for 30 years. And especially when you're teaching things such as entertainment or sports, and you want to use a real case of somebody you know, you have to always be thinking in the world of academic freedom, just how much you can say. Because guys are sitting, ladies and guys are sitting there with computers in your classroom, logging everything. Before you know it, you walk out and suddenly you're on YouTube.
Well,
I think it's changed the world.
That's been, I mean, it's interesting, your last point answers the question I was going to ask, but it sounds to me like what you're saying is that, well, that's always been true for celebrities, that the world we live in now, the risks, the possibility of something that you never thought was going to blow things up can happen more easily now in this new information.
Many times, you can be, if you're ever in front of a television camera, and you are just sitting there, you literally have to practice. Just think about this for a second. When they introduce you, do you smile? Do you nod? You come off looking like I can't say because all the cameras are on. So you have to be very careful, and politicians are always rehearsed. And some, unfortunately, run off at the mouth, and then everybody is making a big thing out of what they said. And it's normal, everyday thinking that goes through your mind, and we all do it.
And to your point about academia, I know that less than a year, or about a year ago, Columbia University was embroiled in a huge issue because of concerns about the way in which the Middle Eastern Studies program there was or was not biased in the way it presented issues of Israeli and Palestinian relationships. The argument was in favor of the Palestinians, but a good deal of that effort to discredit the Columbia University Middle Eastern Studies program was fueled and worked through both traditional video and new media as well. So your point's well taken about that. And as you all probably know, there was an unfortunate and unfair incident here at Penn early in President Gutman's tenure, where she was innocently enough invited first-year students to her house for a Halloween party. One of the kids, probably inappropriately, came dressed as a suicide bomber. A picture was taken with her standing next to him, and next thing you know, in a lot of the online press, there were statements about, does the president of the University of Pennsylvania support terrorism? So there are all kinds of ways in which you can misstep in this new environment. But Peter,
I was going to say, when I see her later, I won't remind her of that, but that's one of the things I had in mind. Yeah, that just what I had in mind.
It's unfortunate and unfair, though there are also lots of positive benefits that come out of this environment. But Peter, either with the Imus case or other cases, do you find yourself now having to follow stories that come out of other places than is normally the case, and don't feel like you're, as a journalist, in as much control of them, or?
A little bit. I'll give you a few sort of disjointed reactions to that. One is, Lloyd, I think you're probably exaggerating a little bit the extent to which these comments can kill a career, because Don Imus is back, and he even has prostate cancer, and has a lot of people feeling sorry for him, and so it's these careers are rehabilitable, I guess, if that's the right word. You could rehabilitate them pretty well, probably with. You've probably been in that situation yourself.
Charitably being reborn or having an illness always helps.
But Alec Baldwin is even back with a book attacking his wife after some shocking comments he made to his daughter came out. So there may be life after some of these comments. Another reaction is that at various times I've defended having even the mainstream press covering some of these incidents, because they become the way that America talks about some underlying tensions, that all the stories don't come out of Washington, and all the disputes aren't framed by political arguments. There are comments like the one that Don Imus made that obviously strike people as being hideously offensive, and may represent to some people the kind of comments they hear around bars all the time, and it's totally inappropriate, and there's this tremendous energy around them that's not always just people wanting to bring down a celebrity. It's people genuinely responding to what's happened in society. It's like happened with the O.J. Simpson thing in the 90s, which spurred all kinds of interesting discussions. The last thing I will say, though, is that I think that in a positive way, in the last 25 years or so, we've become a little bit less condemning as a society of some of these comments. And I remember even back at my time at Penn, there was a professor, an adjunct professor, who made a comment that was arguably inappropriate, not nearly as offensive as the one that Don Imus made, but that pointed out somebody's race in a way that was inappropriate in the classroom. And I had, as a Daily Pennsylvanian reporter, done a story on that particular professor, and I remember talking to him, and he was at that time like a Penn graduate, about 30 or 35 years out, and was clearly a legal studies instructor, and he was thrilled. You know, he was the most loyal Penn guy and the most enthusiastic person, and we were doing a story on him because he was such a popular teacher, even though he was not part of the regular faculty. He was a hugely popular teacher. And then he made this comment, and it truly was, you know, the death penalty was administered, and his career was over. And I remember thinking at that time, despite having sympathy, particularly then, for the kind of liberal thinking that was behind saying that these comments are totally inappropriate, and believing strongly that we needed to create a campus that was more receptive, particularly to minority students, and there was a tremendous problem with minority attrition then, to some degree now. But I remember also feeling there was something a little bit harsh and condemning. You know, we're not the Spanish Inquisition here, and we shouldn't be. And the totality of this person's career wasn't wrapped up in that. And what happened, I think, in the last 25 years is that very quickly the outrage that the liberals imposed on some conservatives, and that was the era when Jimmy the Greek made comments, and Al Campanis made comments, and all these things. And the conservatives started adopting the same attitude. It became, John Kerry told a joke that diminished the troops, and somebody else is, saying something that seems disloyal to America. Happily, now we've moved to a point of maturity in society, and I think some of the tensions which did exist along the race lines, particularly, and some of the cultural lines, may be lessening at this moment. That we can tolerate these things. There can be life, and there can be smiles after some of this kind of.
Peter, while you have the microphone, you talked earlier about your sense that we need some notion of the neutral, objective reporter in journalism even more than ever, partly because of some of the things that you just talked about, I think. But could you talk a little bit about what it's like in the newsroom right now with all these changes that are going on, economic challenges from other sources of information, cutting back of the news staff in some cases, economic problems with the Boston Globe or the Philadelphia Inquirer. What's the mental health of journalists, if you want?
The mental health is poor, and I say this knowing that it could go out on YouTube, and the fact that I'm willing to say it that straightforwardly shows that within the profession nobody's going to come and say, oh, come on, you're exaggerating. I mean, people are very, very concerned, and obviously what we've seen is a long standing kind of structural decline, which is related to the ad-based economy of news organizations. And what's essentially happened is newspaper advertising is migrating from print to the web. But there's so many other places on the web that advertisers can go, particularly Google and Yahoo, where everybody is going there 1,000 times a day to just do searches. That Google and Yahoo are setting the rates on the web, and the rates are quite low for advertisements. So even if you're Philly.com or Boston.com or NewYorkTimes.com, you can't set the rates high enough to make anything like the money that you're losing on print. So it's a structural conundrum that people don't have a good answer for, and so anyone who looks at it seriously says there's big trouble coming, and people in the newsroom are certainly aware of that. Now, all that said, there are substantive challenges that are not economic, like some of the ones that I referred to before, and so there tends to be, I think, too often a confusion between the economic challenge on the one hand and the challenge of trying to meet the needs of today's news consumer, and to accommodate the fact that people are getting so much information on the web and on YouTube, and so much of this news is happening sort of virally, and that the mandarins of the old media can't control it anymore. My feeling in the news business is that there's a challenge for people to sort of separate out the two things. There's the challenge of finding a better economic model, but there's also the challenge of creating a product that will have the greatest amount of influence and relevance in the future. And to some extent, they're running on parallel paths.
That's right.
Earlier, I had spoken about the music industry and the difference between then and now and how hard it is, if it's even possible, to get a record deal anymore. The television industry for reporters and journalists is even worse shape. There are actually hiring freezes amongst several of the cable and network companies. Not firing freezes, hiring freezes. And what we are seeing is that if you represent the talent end of it, trying to put an anchor or a weather person or a new reporter, usually when you become a new reporter, just as you don't go to the New York Times and newspaper right off. Well, in television or radio, you don't go to New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, or LA first. Not knocking Dunk, Iowa, or Fort Huachuca. A lot of the beginning people, in order to get their wings, their experience, have to take jobs wherever they can. What is happening now is that television is drastically cutting back in every way they can. So much so that I even represented a helicopter pilot who did news. I never thought about losing a helicopter pilot. I mean, how many are there? And you have a certain number of helicopters. Well, in order to save money, the television stations have all combined and use one helicopter and one person, which means that 3 helicopter pilots and 3 helicopters have been grounded. And it's evident everywhere.
Lloyd, since you're talking about representing people in the news industry, could you talk a little bit about, since you do both entertainment personalities and people in the news, and you've been doing this for quite some time, what's it like representing someone in the news industry, and are the expectations different for both what they do, what qualities are looked for, the fact that you oftentimes will see at least some newscasters appearing on other kinds of shows? Has that end of the business changed?
I think I'm going to lose half my clientele if I really answer. So here's the perception, here's the reality. At one time, I really just thought, well, everybody on television believes they're journalists. So the party line is, yes, you are a journalist and you have to be bright, you have to write well. You have to have great looking hair. I couldn't make it as a television anchor. That has changed a great deal. I really believe that with the economy the way it is, you are seeing more and more, quote, superstars, end of quote, finding that as their contracts come to an end, they don't get renewed, and cheaper, younger talent is taking their place. It's not easy these days in the television industry.
And is part of your job, even with people that are in the news industry, to get them seen in other kind of venues and other kinds of shows and things like that?
Yeah, well, the reality is exposure. We used to say, as long as you can get in the newspaper, no matter what they say about you, it's good. Because people forget. They just remember they heard you or saw you, or you were in the newspaper. And even that has changed a great deal. It used to be that you would hire PR, I was going to say PR animals, but PR people who would go out and get you into a magazine, get a story about you. Now, with YouTube and television the way it is, you can just almost, you're out there. The more that they see you, the better it is. And it takes all kinds of different avenues to get publicity. But yes, if you are represented, well, what is interesting is contractually, the television reporters and anchors do have some integrity. There, I said it. We really do. They do have integrity. Not only are there morals clauses in most all of sports and celebrity contracts, but they're prohibited usually from taking money for doing certain kinds of speaking and endorsements. And ironically enough, the television networks truly enforce that to the point where there have been a few cases, and I was involved in one, where there was a television reporter who decided she was going to write that great novel. We all have great novels. I'm still waiting 2 years to get published, and my agent won't help me. But the reality is that the station where she was working had a prohibition in her contract. She decided she was going to go ahead and get this book out, and the book was so innocuous, and she was discharged. I mean, it was a great piece of litigation for lawyers, but other than that.
Peter, what about in the print media? It seems to me, just as a viewer of television, a reader of newspapers, that you see more writers for newspapers where it used to be that you wanted to be known for your writing, appearing on local talk shows and various things. Is there an internal move in that direction in your business?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a very smart move if people, particularly in Washington, you know, if you're planning on a full lifetime career in the Washington Press Corps, and you could do a lot worse, because a lot of the people in the Washington Press Corps are 70 and 80, you know, there's no mandatory retirement in the Washington Press Corps. You become a multi-platform journalist, and you brand yourself. And so many of the print journalists of 10 and 20 years ago, someone like Chris Matthews started as a print journalist, slowly migrated towards television. And some of them kept the print day job, and some of them didn't as time went on. But nowadays, even for younger journalists, some quite young, they will do a blog and essentially take a loss on it, or work very hard on it for very little money, but sort of use the blog to get them on TV, to sell book contracts, to sell magazine articles, and the most successful ones do quite well. So the idea that journalists are kind of breaking away from their employer and selling themselves as products is one way to have a lucrative career in the press. Now, I think there are some deleterious effects on the quality of the journalism that's being produced when people are strung out that thin. There was an example of the Philadelphia Inquirer with Stephen A. Smith, who was a columnist who was found to be doing most of his time on television. There was another sports writer I know who was removed from his job because he saved a piece of news that was vital to his main employer to be able to announce it on a radio show, because he really wanted to curry favor with the radio audience. So there can be a distorting effect to journalists' efforts to market themselves.
I have an esoteric question for you, Pete. I've often wondered about it. I have a son. One of my sons is a journalist at Bloomberg in New York. So I watch a lot of that. I watch Fast Money. I'm hooked on Jim Cramer. I watch 53. Do you think we really would, the perception and the reality, which is our topic, do you really think we would have as bad a recession as we're having if the news and all the talking heads every single day didn't keep coming at us with terrible news? What would happen if we didn't hear about any of this? Do you think walking around we'd even know there's a recession?
Yes, I mean those of us who work for newspapers certainly know there's a recession. I think that I think that many Americans are suffering in many different ways, and if people think of their peer circles, the suffering ranges from the senior law partner or whatever who may be accustomed to making a very, very high salary, but now finds the younger partners want to retire because they need to cut the pie somehow, and the firm's receipts are down 20%. But it goes all the way down to literally the people who've lost their jobs and can't pay their mortgages. So I think that people would realize that there was an economic recession just based on...
No, I'm asking if it really is exacerbated by all of the talking heads every day, every night, on every show. I mean, they're all doing well.
I think there's obviously a megaphone effect to cable news, and it's had a deleterious effect to some degree on political discussion, and it's had a deleterious effect to some degree on economic discussion as well. But I would hate for people to sort of see that as an indictment of the whole idea of having media cover these problems, because what we need is better business coverage, not no business coverage.
And I think, in fact, that's the real interesting point in all this, which, apropos of the topic of today's panel, it was Jon Stewart who was the one who kind of raked Kramer over the coals publicly for not the fact that they were covering business or talking about business, but that they so took both their entertainment piece of what they do more seriously than the news coverage piece of what they do, and that they were awfully cozy with the very people that they were recommending investments in, that they may have exacerbated the buildup in the stock market that led to some of the downturn. Now that is also equally debatable, and certainly there was a lot of good financial reporting going on in newspapers mainly, but the issue of would we have not had as serious a recession if there had been better financial coverage that was paid attention to in the years prior to the recession is an interesting question as well. And again, that's not to indict all financial reporters, but I would at least suggest that some of the cutbacks in the newsroom and some of the move towards more entertainment, cable coverage of financial issues was at least implicated in some of that.
And I would also reemphasize one of the points that I made before, which is within the news profession, people tend to shrug these things off too easily. So things like the pre-Iraq War reporting, they'll sort of say, well, we did the best we could, and the government is the source of most information, and Bush was arguing against the UN inspectors, so we didn't want to take them too seriously, and whatever. I mean, there are all these alibis, and the same thing with the business press, and there are various ways in which they weren't getting the full financial statements, and they were only seeing a piece of the larger picture and things like that. But what it adds up to is a very, very serious lack of faith in the mainstream media, and it really does a lot of damage that continues to be done in terms of how people perceive the news and the news business. And so we have to do a better job, and we have to take it very seriously.
I'm going to ask one more general question for both of you, and then open it up to the audience. So start thinking about what you would like to ask our two guests. But issue of docudramas, and it's one area that I look at, and there's been several controversies over the last year. One of the most recent ones, the ABC's broadcast of The Path to 9/11, which was a docudrama about the origins of the Al-Qaeda and the terrorist attacks on 9/11, that stirred a tremendous controversy. ABC was an entertainment-produced show, but it was broadcast on the 5th anniversary of 9/11 and was advertised or promoted as being a documentary type reenactment of the events leading up to 9/11 based on the 9/11 Commission report. And there was great debate that it stirred over how accurate it was, whether it was biased politically or not. I'd be curious from both an entertainment and a news perspective what your feelings are about what looks to me like the increasing presence of contemporary politics in entertainment media, and what the positive and negative implications of some of that might be. Either of you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that the issue of staging portions of the news and all that is obviously something that most journalists consider totally off limits, and a serious violation of the profession and sort of professional ethics. And people are taught from a very early age, from their very first job, not to assume anything, not to make anything up, not to present something that a person says as being the truth without rigorously attributing it. All that said, I mean, I think it's an issue for the television networks where these things occur, for their newsrooms to try to sort of lay down the rules with the rest of the network to try to get the kind of protections they need to preserve the integrity of the news broadcast. You can imagine a world, again, in this viral media situation where, if the three of us decided we wanted to go off and, in a frankly speculative kind of way, do a documentary on what would have happened if Al Gore had been president in 2000 or something like that, there certainly will be people who will, be confused by it and who will take things that we say as being either, there'll be people who will mistake it for the literal truth, and there'll be people who look at it and think that we're being wildly favorable to Al Gore, and there'll be people who think we're insulting Al Gore, and there'll be people who think we're insulting Bush and all that kind of thing. But, if it's sort of labeled as what it is, I don't think there should be an absolute, let's cut off any idea of doing docudramas. They've been around for a while and we can survive, but they do have to be labeled as such and separated from the news reports.
I'm for integrity and transparency. Having said that, I'm involved in 2 documentaries right now as we are speaking. And one is involving mental health. And
These docudramas or?
docudramas, yes.
And so as you're involved with something like that, obviously, as Peter said, if you're a journalist, you've at least got some norms and rules as to what is within bounds and what is not. Does that come up as an issue when you're doing it in a more fictional setting? I mean, what do you think the public interest obligations of the producers and directors and writers are?
No, I actually agree with you that there has to be limits and boundaries. And a lot of it is done by hoping that your producer, your director, and usually the main subject in a documentary or a docudrama really are focused in on what they are trying to achieve, what the reality of what it is that they are trying to get across. I think a lot of that, and what we try to do, is actually put disclaimers in a lot of what we do. The ones that I have real problems with on television, and I've been involved in a few infomercials, and I'm not going to mention them right now, but there are some that, if you buy their device, you start looking like you're 23 when you're 70. I don't know. And I fear, especially, I want to go out and get every vitamin that this guy says, just take this vitamin, maybe it'll help my backhand, I don't know. But the point is that there are quite a few people that when they are seeing these things on television, especially when there's a guy in a white coat with a stethoscope around his neck and he's an actor, and he's an actor, we know he's an actor, those are dangerous in a lot of ways.
Questions from the audience? Yes.
We were talking earlier about the shows that some were like scripted, like some of the reality shows like on MTV. There seems to be a lot more. What part of those shows is scripted? Like what of it is reality?
Yeah, you know this. I do.
I've had the privilege of representing a few people on the Real World and Bachelorette, and a couple of people who have tried out for Celebrity Apprentice and Survivor and everything. There is, I just can't be saying everything I'm thinking right now. Parts of it would be really amazing, wouldn't it, if they were all just happening that instant the way they happen. I think that one can only use their imagination. Reality is reality. It's the perception of reality, and it's not really all reality. Sometimes it's whatever it is. Having said that, there's some reality.
I was going to say, I think this is another cause for the importance of transparency and labeling things as such, and that reality TV shows that have scripted moments should really make it clear what's a scripted moment. I saw a very high-end example. I happened to see this French movie called The Class, which is about a teacher in an urban area dealing with a kind of multicultural situation with a lot of Islamic students sort of talking back to him and stuff. And there's an interesting sort of twist in that the teacher, who's a really understanding, kind of heroic teacher part, kind of cracks up halfway through and turns on one of the students, and there's implications that come from that. Well, I later found out that, it was sort of improvised, the movie, but they were kind of guided. They were not, it wasn't really just a camera in the classroom. It was people being told what to say. And it totally, in my mind, completely discredited what it had said. I mean, I had the same reaction reading the book Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. When you read at the very end, they say that certain parts were fictionalized, and characters were changed and all that. I mean, it totally destroyed the effect of the book. So I think that there ought to be an ethical precept that things that are scripted should.
Yes.
There seems to be a wringing of hands about how terrible things are right now, and how things are leaving the mainstream media and so on. Does everybody remember how many newspapers we used to have in New York City? And what happened to them? And the ones that survived did very well? And that this is actually the natural order of things, that things will move to the next level, and that we really shouldn't be as upset as we are. I think the alienation that a lot of the people are feeling is the continual, if it bleeds, it leads, and nobody wants to see that anymore. And I think there are a lot of people that would probably feel that the #1 news show on television is The Daily Show.
Well, there are a lot of different things, a lot of different reactions to what you were saying. One is, you're right that the bleeds, it leads, and the scream fests on cable TV and all that have colored people's impressions of the media in a very negative way. And I would have said that, 40 years ago, maybe, if you asked the average person what they thought of when they thought of the media, they would think of their local newspaper, and they think of like the paper boy who delivered it, and they think of the local reporter who kind of spelled everyone's name correctly, and they would have a more positive view of the media. Somewhere along the 80s, maybe, somewhere in the 90s, when television became more predominant and people started thinking in terms of the Washington media, I think that now if you say, what is your impression of the media? They'd say, oh, it's O'Reilly, or it's Keith Olbermann, or it's whatever that is. And it's a more negative kind of impression. Now, all of that said, though, when you're saying that what's happening in the news business is that people don't want to read the papers because they're no good anymore and stuff, in fact, between the web and print, there's more readership than ever for the paper. I mean, the stories that we write in the Boston Globe have far greater readership, and we can count it on the web. Both the local stories, because we have 5 million exclusive users online, but especially the stories we do in Washington, which used to just go to the readers up in Boston, now are read nationally. So the appetite seems to be there for the stories, and I don't think that the stories have let people down because the readership is there. It's an economic problem. As to what you're saying about the days when there were 7 p.m. newspapers and there were many papers and things like that, some of that will be replicated on the web in that there'll be a lot of ideological media competing with some more mainstream presentations. And in the days 15, 60 years ago in New York City, there were papers that were frankly sensational, and there were papers that were frankly Republican, and papers that were frankly Democrat, and then there were a couple in the middle that people trusted. And perhaps the same thing will happen on the web. So I sort of agree with you in terms of the long, big picture, where we're going to be in 30 years, 40 years. But in terms of where we are for the next 10 years, I'm less confident.
Lloyd, do you have any thoughts on
Particularly, I kind of like Adam's myth and the wealth of nations, and I do think that it's survival of the fittest, if that's what you're saying. And everything is a cycle, everything is repetition. I think, was it Harry Truman who said there's nothing new in life, only that which you haven't seen before. So primarily, yeah, we're going to come out of this recession and things will be better down the road, whether it's a V, a U, a W, I don't know. It's interesting. I wish I had really thought of this and framed it, so I don't want to take somebody else's comment, but if you think of this whole recession and all of this in terms of toothpaste, and you took some pain and you shoved it, I told you this is not mine, I'm not taking credit for it, but you put all of the pain into toothpaste and a tube. You have 2 choices. You could squeeze it real fast and all of the pain would come out at once and the banks would have collapsed, which you're smiling about. And the automotive industries would have gone under, and we would not have had stimulus, and we would not have had all of these things. And yes, some would survive, and then the world would continue. Different, but the world would continue. And the other school of thought is, okay, let's squeeze a little bit of the pain out now. We'll give some stimulus. We'll squeeze a little bit more out. We'll take care of some of the automotive companies. squeeze a little more out. We'll take care of certain of the favored banks. See, I'm jaded. And it would take, what will happen is it'll just take much longer. And it's easing it. The real question you're asking is whether there should be government intervention or we should go back to Adam Smith and let things happen the way they are, and those that survive, survive.
Well, it was the absence of government after the Telecommunications Act in 1996 that caused all this stuff, because it allowed everybody to overinflate the prices of the sticks and the media values, and you lost differentiation of programming, and now people they can't find a bigger fool to take this stuff off their hands.
Well, that's the whole issue of the stock market, isn't it? The damn fool theory. I'll buy a stock anytime if there's other damn fools who will pay more for it than I do.
I have a few thoughts on this. First of all, I agree with your basic premise, which is, look, there's a lot more positive going on in this new information environment than we've sort of focused on. I think the Daily Show is probably one of the great additions to public discourse that we've had in the last number of years, without question. I also think that and I think Peter has stated this, that the news industry, whether it's newspapers or especially television news, has brought about some of their own decline in the way in which they've covered certain kinds of issues, and in their inability to see that oftentimes news, especially on television, needs to be in context, and that tying it to other kinds of issues the way the Daily Show does is not always such a bad thing. And being so neutral can sometimes, the difference between being objective and being contextless is a really fine line, and sometimes they've crossed into that. The place, so I think there are both potentially great and potentially problematic aspects of this new information environment. The place where I would disagree, or at least put on the table, is that if you look at the history of news, as opposed to other kind of economic goods, the idea that it's got enough of a public interest aspect to it that's got to be treated a little bit differently has always been there. I mean, whether you start with the post office or the way in which magazines and newspapers paid cheaper prices for mails in the 19th century, the fairness doctrine and the equal time doctrine when there were only 3 news stations. So there's got to be some kind of balance. I'm nervous about letting the market system completely determine something that has as much of a democratic value as news does. And but I agree that I think that this new environment has at least as much potential excitement and positive aspects as it does negative aspects. I just think we need, as a society, to not just let that happen completely automatically, but to kind of move it a little bit so that we wind up with something that we think is beneficial to us all. And some of that is a public good. Yes?
I'm not sure I totally agree with what you just said.
That's fine.
I'm thinking of the young readership.
Mm-hmm.
The young people who are used to all of this information coming in, which in many cases I think is somewhat superficial. They're used to, instant, almost sensationalism, the kind of reporting that's going on some of the, if you choose to watch TV, it's, sort of early sensationalism. Maybe they'll catch a 30-second segment as to what's happening internationally. They're not getting that deep, rich, investigative journalism that the Globe is used to doing. I'm a Boston person, so I love the physicality of the Globe. So I'm concerned. I'm concerned about the young people and what they're getting used to with this new environment that we have with the the blogging and the.
Sure.
But I think it's somewhat superficial.
Okay, I'd like to respond, but please, if you've got thoughts on that.
I would say that my view is slightly less alarmed than yours, because I think that young people, particularly we've seen in the last few years, have re-engaged significantly in the problems of society, and you can certainly see it in Washington now more and more. I mean, some of it maybe because of the economy, but more and more young people are just coming to Washington wanting to like work with advocacy groups and things. There's also much more of an international consciousness on the part of young people, and they must be getting that foreign news somewhere. It's probably not. It's not probably not in the Boston Globe, but they're getting some of it off of the internet. I mean, the problem that I would have is how rounded their perspectives are. So they've made the commitment and they believe in the issues, but I'm not sure that the news media is playing its role in molding the generation of young people into real kind of rounded citizens rather than just impassioned activists or believers of one thing or another.
Yes, please.
I've taught for 41 years at Community College of Philadelphia, and I have to tell you that every year I ask the same question: what's your tolerance for reading before you want to get up and do something else? In 1969, it was 140, 150 pages. It is now 2 pages and maybe 2.5. And that is the tolerance. They have been entertained by short spurts from Sesame Street on. They expect everybody to entertain them, and they really do not care whether the issue falls on this side or that side. They just want to be entertained. They want to have good sex. They want love. They don't know how to give in. I could go on and on, but I'm very concerned about their ability to take in information and to weigh it, and nobody's requiring anything of it. I just read that one of the big publishers is going to have one-line blogs. Great one-liners.
Well, this is Twitter.
Yeah.
So
One-liners, is that all we're going to do? Are we going to turn into a third world country overnight?
These are common views among people who are celebrating their 25th reunion and like myself. But I wonder what the younger people think of this. I mean,
how do you like the way that you've been presented? Do you recognize yourself in any of this?
I actually don't think it's very fair. I think different is not necessarily bad, and I think we're just in a state of change, and it's kind of maybe a little bit premature to kind of put a value judgment on where we are. I think it takes a little bit of time and perspective. I can certainly read more than 2.5 pages at a time and not be bored. Maybe I favor things that I'm more passionate about, but I agree with you David before that I think more of the danger is being well-rounded because, there are so many different options for me to get news that I tend to take in news that, I agree with and that I find interesting, so I don't necessarily seek out, alternate opinions. But, I think the way you said it, I think it's the difference between people celebrating their 25th reunion versus their 50th reunion.
I think there's a heavy element. I don't think that's the only thing that's going on personally. I don't think anybody in this room thinks that's the only thing going on, but I do think there's an element of that to this misunderstanding what's mistaking something that's different for something that's worse. Now, that's not to say the 2 points that were just made don't make sense to some degree, but the irony is that if you want to be informed today, you have at your fingertips much more information than I had when I was growing up or other people, older people in this room had. The ability to find out information from sources other than the typical sources that you might go to is phenomenal right now. And I think the jury's still out on what that means. It is true that younger generations are reading newspapers less. And what the long-term implications of that are going to be. What really matters, I think, is what happens with professional journalism. I think there's an important role for professional journalism. Whether professional journalism survives in some new reincarnation or not, that's not the problem. That's an economic problem. That's a problem for people who print newspapers. That's a problem for people who do broadcast news or who own broadcast news stations. But the real issue, if you care about this in a small d democracy kind of way, is do we need, which I think we do, people whose job it is to sift through the information environment day to day and tell us information that might be valuable to us, and that's what professional journalists are trained to do. I think that would be a problem if we lost that as part of that. Yes?
I think when you look at reality TV and some of these other things, you've tried to school people to be more intelligent about what they're viewing. I feel that way about books. I mean, these politicians put out a book a year, and who's writing it for them, and who's, oh, this is the authority on global warming, or just put this out in 20 minutes, or whatever. And I think you say, oh, I read a whole book about this, and I really am informed. Not really. I think from print to TV to the web, you really, as an English major, we were brought up to look very askance at everything that came across and distrust everything and see where the bias was and to look at everything that comes across your path in that way. And I think if good universities keep up that approach, we'll find our way through this, but you sure have to look at things that way.
I want to say I especially share that concern where book publishing is concerned because you could imagine whoever you would think of as being the most credible authority on global warming, whether it was the tenured professor with the most expertise or the environmental writer who has devoted 30 to 40 years of their career to studying this issue. If those people put in a book proposal to a publisher right now, it would not get as much attention as Ann Coulter or somebody with a book that has the title Global Warming is Bunk, because they know that there's a passionate audience out there that thinks global warming is bunk and that is going to rush out and buy that book, just like there's a passionate audience that will buy the book that will have the title saying The Conspiracy to Hide Global Warming from You or something like that, or How the Republicans Have Hidden Global Warming. There'd be a huge audience for that book, and we're losing that sort of studious middle that wants to be informed in a non-ideological way.
Back in the room and then.
Okay, what you were saying before about the breadth of information that's out there is much greater than there was when it was just a print media. Well, that's all well and good, but there's a different dynamic. You don't read the same. I'm sure when you read the paper and when you read something online, you don't read it the same way. When you're online, when I'm online, you read things here and there, you skip whatever. When you read the paper, it's a much more comprehensive dynamic. Like I said, you're turning the page, you start reading the sports, if that's what you're interested in. You turn the page and say, oh, this is interesting to me. And you pick this up, and then you're a little bit smarter because you read about something that you didn't even think about 10 minutes ago. But when you're online, that's not how you read things. So, going back to what they were saying before, it's a generational thing. Okay, I get that too, but these kids here, they're ahead of the curve. We're not an Ivy League university,
right.
So they're a little ahead of the curve. Going to her point, the general public isn't reading, they're reading 2 pages.
Yeah, and so they're all kind of going back to my point that there's lots of promise and lots of things to be concerned about. The issue that you raised, I think, is a really important one, and it's really hard to figure out where it's going to wind up. But you bump into information when you read the newspaper or you watch the local or national television news, not because you chose to bump into it, but because that's been presented to you. How often do you bump into information if you're getting your information from the internet? Well, I think the fear that you expressed is a fear that's been expressed by a lot of people who think and write about this. There are other people who say, no, you know what, you can actually, especially depending on how you design various sites and so on, you can bump into information on the internet. So part of it's a structural thing. How do you design these sites as ways that really work well, so that if I'm going on because I really want to know what the Phillies did last night, that if I go online, I can get the Phillies score, read a couple of newspaper stories about it, and then get offline and never see what the front page had to say. That's the fear at some level. Is that the only way that the internet is going to get us information? I don't know. I also get all kinds of emails from people on something that they read that I never would have thought about had they not sent it to me. So that's the flip side of that. So I think it's an incredibly exciting time to speculate, at least, about what the positive and negative consequences of all this are. But the fear of never getting information, except if it's on a topic you care about, and never getting it from a point of view other than the point of view you care about, is a real fear of this new environment.
Let me just say, I'm class of 64, so I can't remember now what the question was.
How do you think I feel?
But I would like to say that, from what I've read, the younger generation has been going to the dogs since the Romans. And I feel as though, as people grow up and become adults, because human nature isn't changing, they're going to have adult interests. They'll have different ways of getting information, but they'll have essentially the same interests that generations have had before. And if they can't read right now, in community college, they'll still have some interest in doing what adults do in our society. And we all have to adjust to how to get the information, but I wouldn't be a doomsayer because things look differently.
I mean, the issue of what part of this, there are real age differences in newspaper readership or news viewing. What part of it is because when you're young, you have other things you're interested in, and as you get older, you become more, you would say, like past generations, and what part of it is truly generational that will stick with people is another really interesting issue in here. It does look like, in terms of reading paper newspapers, that the decline, the generational decline is very big, and that as Generation X and people younger than Generation X get older, that they're not returning to the newspaper at the same rates as our generation, but they are returning to it. And then the bigger question is the one you just raised at the end, which is, well, maybe they're not returning to print newspaper, but there's other places where they can get information. And it's up to us to make sure that information, there's good information there in these other venues, I think. Yeah.
Given the importance of a fourth branch of government, so to speak, the journalism, professional journalists whose job it is to get it right, and the decline of newspapers and the decline of the electronic media as a source of hard factual information, don't we need economic incentives going forward for the preservation of ethically, grounded journalists? And what are those economic incentives going to be? What does the panel think? Are there going to be any? Or are we going to have a real diffuse internet-based information thing, which is unreliable, and you can find from Rush Limbaugh to Keith Olbermann, whoever you want on the spectrum, and what is reality?
Right.
What's the economic incentive is where I'm going to.
Would you want to take a shot at that?
I never thought of journalism as the fourth branch of government, quite honestly. I think there is something that you say that does have merit. I am concerned that with the reduction of true journalists, some of the truth and transparency in government might not be disclosed. I don't know if I would, this is just my feeling, I don't know that I would go forward and say, let's subsidize newspapers. By the way, that's not something that hasn't been brought up. And there are a number of newspapers who are on the brink of disaster who have gone to politicians and saying you should subsidize it. I agree with the gentleman in the back, and I don't think that everything that is in trouble has to be subsidized. Journalists will survive. The gentleman over here will survive. They will still do their job. And I will touch upon some of the younger members in this room. I fully think that you guys are terrific. You will survive. And these are cycles, and we go through it. In the 50s, everybody worried about us because we wore jeans, unless we went to Penn and had a buckle in the back. You would wear jeans and a DA, and you'd roll up a pack of cigarettes, and in the 60s you changed it for love beads and Nehru jackets, and so on and so forth. And we're all still here, and we're all still alive, and we're still doing well.
You know what, though? I think my concern is that I don't know if we're going to survive, and it's much different than anything that ever happened before the internet presents new challenges to journalism. And I don't know if we're going to survive. If the journalist who spends his career carefully checking the facts to make sure that Nixon gets nailed on Watergate, if he has no economic incentive, if there's no place for him to work that's going to provide him with remuneration to reward what he does, then he won't survive. He'll end up doing something else. He'll become some other type of, profession. Go somewhere else.
That was the one part I agreed with you with on.
So
That's a dominant concern of the profession right now, and some of the things you mentioned are being discussed. I mean, there are models. I mean, it's not being discussed right now, but I would suspect that within the next year or two, more and more people will be pointing to the BBC as an example. The BBC is a respected global news organization that happens to be subsidized by the British government, but has enough of an independent mandate and tradition and sense of standards that it has not been corrupted by the British government. And people will say, see, there's an example of how you can have a public funding without disastrous consequences for democracy. The other example that people sometimes have is partnering with universities and other nonprofits. you know, it's not out of the picture. The Annenberg School of Communication could start its own newspaper. We were talking just before this event that factcheck.org, which came out of the Annenberg School, was sort of a model for something that happened at the St. Petersburg Times that they won a Pulitzer Prize for as a fact-check service. But, you know, the difference between doing it through the Annenberg School and doing it through the St. Petersburg Times isn't that great. So nonprofit, so universities could step in. And then there are foundations like the ones who are founding something called ProPublica, which is a public interest investigative reporting site that works with newspapers and supplies investigative reporters to work with newspapers, that for-profit newspapers. So there are some models out there like that.
Yeah, the third model that actually there's even some beginnings of federal legislation, though, as Lloyd mentioned, the news industry itself is split on this, is to have a mixed model where newspapers are treated partially as nonprofits. So that they can still do advertising and raise money, but that money would be put back into the newspaper and that they would get tax exemptions.
Public broadcasting.
What's that?
Isn't that what public broadcasting is today?
Well, that's part of what public broadcasting is today, that's right, yeah. It's a public broadcasting model, that's right. But I'm not sure what the conclusion of your point is at that.
No, it already exists.
Oh, that, it exists for public broadcasting, that's right, but the legislation that's being considered now would be that newspapers could be treated that way. Yeah, that's right. So there are all kinds of mixed models out there, but each one carries a risk with it, right? So one of the reasons why people in the newspaper industry, some people have come out and said, we don't want this federal help on this, is because one of the things that newspapers pride themselves on is being independent from government so that they can cover government. And one of the downsides, but it really gets down in the end to the nitty-gritty details of how these models exist. So the British BBC model is based on a tax on television sets, and it's set up in perpetuity, although legislation gets reconsidered every once in a while. The public broadcasting model was a congressional piece of legislation that had to be passed every year that said, here's how much money we're going to give to PBS. So like during the Vietnam War, when PBS did one of the reasons why you see a lot of nature shows on PBS and don't see a lot of hard-hitting investigative journalism is precisely because of the way that model was set up. And so the details are what are going to really matter, and some kind of, but could you imagine a world in which, if left to the market, the current market, that professional journalism would wither to the point where it did not exist to the extent that it does even now, and it's already withered to some degree already? I don't know the answer to that question, obviously, but I can tell you that for the first time, I oftentimes get calls to comment on these kind of issues. For the first time ever in the last 6 months, journalists themselves, who are the ones who ask the questions, have asked that question to me, where I never would get a question. It would be, what's the quality of newspapers? What do we do about the cuts in newspapers? Or what does it mean that there's going to be only one newspaper rather than two in the city? But the questions now have included, and could you imagine Boston or Philadelphia or some other city actually not having a major daily newspaper? And that suggests that there's at least more concern that might be a possibility. What happens when that happens? Who knows? But I can tell you that a lot of what goes on the internet right now that are blog-based or other video-based, a good deal of that is actually dependent on what professional journalists do. It's a kind of a second-level discussion of things that journalists have done. So even the internet changes if there are not professional journalists. We are actually at our time limit, I'm sorry. So this has been a great discussion. I hope you enjoyed it. I'd like to thank our panelists and thank our audience.